She was 12 years old. She had just performed in her school Christmas concert. She came home, kicked off her shoes, and sat down beside the warmth of a space heater next to the family Christmas tree. 60 minutes later, she was gone. No screams. No signs of a struggle. No forced entry. Just a pair of small shoes sitting perfectly on the floor in front of an empty couch, and footprints in the snow outside the living room window, footprints that someone had tried to erase with a garden rake pulled from her own family's garage. And the man who did it spent the next 37 years filing legal documents, running for public office, giving media interviews, and inserting himself into the very investigation that was always meant to catch him, because he simply could not stay away. He could not stop talking. He could not stop writing. And every single word he said, every single document he filed, every single time he opened his mouth about this little girl, he was slowly and methodically building the very case that would eventually put him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. If this story already has your full attention, hit that like button right now, subscribe to True Crime Traces, and turn on the notification bell, because this is exactly the kind of case that will follow you long after the screen goes dark, and you do not want to miss a single story we bring to this channel. We cover the cases that deserve to be remembered. And this one, more than almost any other we have ever told, deserves every single second of your attention. Her name was Jonelle Matthews. And to understand what truly happened to her, to understand the full weight of this story, you first have to understand who she was before any of this. Because this was not just some name buried in a cold case file. This was not just a photograph on a milk carton or a line in a presidential speech. This was a real child. A living, breathing, laughing, performing, completely alive little girl who made every single room she walked into feel warmer and louder and better just by being in it. And the world she came from, before the night everything changed, was about as far from darkness as you can possibly imagine. Jonelle was born on the 9th of February, 1972, in Santa Barbara, California. But her story begins with heartbreak before it even truly starts. Her biological mother, Terry Vera Martinez, was just 13 years old when Jonelle came into the world. 13. A child herself. Not yet in high school. Not yet old enough to drive a car. And yet here she was, holding a newborn daughter and trying to figure out how to be a mother when she was barely old enough to be considered anything other than a child herself. After about a month of trying to hold everything together, a month of sleepless nights and impossible decisions and the slow, crushing realization that love alone was not going to be enough, Terry made the hardest decision any mother will ever face in her life. She gave Jonelle up for adoption. Not because she did not love her. Not because she did not care. But because she loved her enough to want something far better for her than she could ever provide. That kind of love, the love that lets go, is one of the most painful things a human being can experience. And it is worth pausing here to honor it, even in the middle of everything else. And Jonelle got that something better. She truly did. A couple from the state of Colorado named Jim and Gloria Matthews adopted her within weeks. They already had a daughter named Jennifer, and now, with Jonelle in their arms, their family felt complete. They settled in Greeley, a small, quiet, extraordinarily tight-knit town sitting about 60 miles north of Denver, right in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. The kind of place where kids rode their bikes through the neighborhood until the streetlights came on and nobody worried about where they were. Where families left their front doors unlocked at night without a second thought, because nothing bad happened here. Where everybody knew everybody, their names, their kids, their church, their routines, and the idea that something truly evil could quietly walk through your neighborhood on a dark winter evening was so far outside the realm of possibility that most people never even let the thought enter their minds. Greeley was safe. Greeley was home. Greeley was exactly the kind of place you would choose to raise a family if you wanted your children to grow up knowing what security felt like. Jim Matthews worked as the principal of Platte Valley Elementary School. He was the kind of man who dedicated his professional life to children, patient, principled, deeply community-minded. Gloria worked at a local restaurant and poured everything she had left into her family and her faith. Together, they were devoted and active members of their church, the Sunny View Church of the Nazarene, a congregation that would become central not just to their daily lives, but to every thread of this entire story. Their home was warm in every sense of the word. And Jonelle was the absolute spark of it. Her friends described her as theatrical, hilarious, and endlessly dramatic in the best possible way, and they meant every word of that as the highest compliment. She had a gift for making people laugh. She had a presence that was simply too big for any single room to contain. She loved performing in church skits, singing with her school choir, staying up too late at sleepovers, and completely losing her mind over the Latin boy band Menudo in the way only a 12-year-old in the 1980s could. She was the kind of kid who treated everything like it mattered, the small things and the big things alike, because to her, everything genuinely did. Life was exciting and worth experiencing fully. People were worth loving loudly and without reservation. And Christmas was the most magical thing in the entire world. And Christmas was coming. Jonelle Matthews was completely buzzing with the anticipation of it, counting down the days, practically vibrating with excitement the way only children at that age still can. The 20th of December, 1984. 5 days before Christmas. A Thursday evening. This is the day that changes everything, for Jonelle, for her family, for the small and trusting town of Greeley, and ultimately, for a killer who would spend the next 37 years convincing himself he had gotten away with it. Jonelle had been sick with a cold in the days leading up to this night. She had been sniffling and coughing and feeling run down, and any reasonable parent might have expected her to want to curl up under a blanket and rest. But that was not who Jonelle was. She practically begged her parents to let her go to school that day. She had Christmas gifts that she had carefully chosen for friends she would not see again for weeks over the holiday break, and more importantly, she had been selected to perform with the Franklin Middle School Honor Choir at their annual holiday concert that evening. This was not something you skipped. This was not something you let a runny nose take away from you. Wild horses could not have kept Jonelle Matthews away from that stage. Jim and Gloria gave her permission to go, with one clear and loving condition: you perform, you come straight home afterward, and you rest. Jonelle promised them she would. And she meant it. And off she went into the cold December evening, full of life and excitement and the absolute certainty that everything was fine. That evening, the concert was held at a local venue and was even broadcast on a local cable network, a big deal for a middle school choir in a small Colorado town in 1984. Jonelle performed with her classmates, sang Christmas carols with everything she had, and spent the time before and after the show laughing and talking with her best friend Deanna Ross. The two of them had that particular kind of friendship that only exists when you are 12 years old and completely convinced that your best friend is the funniest and most interesting person on the entire planet. After the show wound down and the families began gathering their coats and heading for the exits, Deanna's father, Russell Ross, offered to drive Jonelle home. It was a short drive, a natural kindness, the kind of small neighborly gesture that happens 1,000 times a day in towns like Greeley. Jonelle accepted. She climbed into the car. And that car ride was the last normal moment of her life. At approximately 8:15 in the evening, Russell pulled up to the Matthews family home on West 18th Street. Jonelle climbed out of the car, turned back to say goodbye to Deanna, wished her a Merry Christmas with the easy warmth of someone who fully expected to see her friend again in a few weeks, and walked up the driveway toward the front door. Russell and Deanna sat in the car and watched her go. They did not pull away immediately. They waited, the way good people do, until they were sure she was safely inside. The front door opened. Jonelle stepped through. And then the light in the foyer flickered on. That was the signal. The unspoken agreement that exists in safe, trusting neighborhoods everywhere. The light comes on, it means I am in, I am home, everything is fine, you can go. Russell drove away into the winter night. He had done everything right. He had no idea, no possible way of knowing, that he was the last person on Earth, other than her killer, to ever see Jonelle Matthews alive. At around 8:30 that same evening, Jonelle answered a phone call at the family home. It was a teacher from her father's school calling to leave a message saying he would not be coming in the following morning. Jonelle answered politely. She took the message carefully and responsibly. She sounded completely fine, normal, calm, like any 12-year-old at home on a school night. The teacher thanked her and hung up. That phone call is the last confirmed contact anyone outside of that house ever had with Jonelle Matthews. The last time her voice was heard by anyone who lived to talk about it. After that, silence. Something happened inside that house in the hour that followed. Something that moved with terrifying speed and left almost nothing behind. Jim Matthews had been out that evening at Jennifer's basketball game, watching his older daughter play, sitting in the bleachers of a gymnasium completely unaware that his world was ending 15 minutes away. Gloria was out of state, having traveled to care for her sick mother, doing what mothers do, showing up for the people who need them. When Jim pulled into the driveway at around 9:30 that evening, tired from the game, looking forward to checking on Jonelle and getting some rest, he expected to find her exactly where she had promised to be. On the couch. Maybe watching television. Maybe already drifting off to sleep with the space heater running. He walked inside. The house was warm. The heater was running. The television was still on and playing to an empty room. Jonelle's favorite shawl was draped across the back of the couch exactly as it always was when she had been sitting there. Her shoes, those small, familiar shoes, sat perfectly on the floor right next to the Christmas tree, exactly where she always left them. The Christmas tree lights were still glowing. The presents underneath were still wrapped and waiting. Everything in that house looked exactly like it did when Jonelle was home. Everything looked like she had been there seconds ago, like she had just stepped into the next room, like she was about to come walking back around the corner. But Jonelle was not there. Jim made phone calls. He called her friends, her classmates, anyone he could think of. Nobody had seen her. When Jennifer came home at 10 o'clock that evening, full of energy from her game, and called out her sister's name and heard nothing come back to her from anywhere in that house, the fear that had been quietly building in Jim's chest became something else entirely. Something that had no name but that every parent understands without explanation. Jim picked up the phone and called the Greeley police. Officers arrived within 15 minutes. And what they found when they began examining the outside of that house stopped every single one of them cold. Footprints in the fresh snow, pressed directly into the ground right outside the living room windows. Large footprints. Deliberate, patient, unhurried. Someone had been standing there in the cold and the dark, right outside that glass, watching through the window. Watching a 12-year-old girl sitting alone by the light of the Christmas tree on the other side. Standing there long enough to leave deep impressions in the snow. And whoever that person was, after whatever happened inside that house, they had then attempted to erase those footprints using a garden rake, a rake they had pulled from the Matthews' own garage, from right there on the property, as though they knew exactly where to find it. They had tried to sweep away the evidence of their presence. They had not succeeded entirely. The impressions were still visible. And the rake had been left behind, discarded in the snow, a chilling piece of evidence from a person who had been deliberate enough to plan ahead but rattled enough to leave in a hurry. No forced entry was found anywhere in the house. No broken windows. No overturned furniture. No signs of a struggle of any kind inside. No neighbors reported hearing a single unusual sound. Whatever happened inside that home happened quietly enough that the world outside it went on completely undisturbed. Whoever did this was calm enough to remain in control. Whoever did this was prepared enough to have thought about the rake ahead of time. And whoever did this knew the property well enough to locate the family's garage tools in the dark on a December night without making a sound. This was not a random act of opportunistic violence. This was not a stranger simply passing through town who happened to stop at the wrong house. This was someone who had been watching. Someone who knew the rhythms and routines of this specific family. Someone who knew that on this particular Thursday evening, Jim Matthews would be at a basketball game and Gloria Matthews would be out of state and a 12-year-old girl would be sitting alone in that warm living room with the Christmas tree lights reflected in the window. Someone had chosen this night specifically. And they had been ready. Police initially considered the possibility that Jonelle had run away from home. Jim Matthews rejected that idea immediately and without hesitation. She had a sleepover planned with her friends the very next day. She was due to perform in a Christmas presentation at church within days. There were wrapped presents sitting under the tree with her name on them and 5 days left until Christmas morning. She had been laughing and performing and saying Merry Christmas to her best friend less than 2 hours before she disappeared. They searched her school locker thoroughly and went through every corner of her bedroom with careful attention. They found no note. No indication of any plan. No evidence of trouble at home or in her friendships or in any part of her life. Jonelle Matthews had not run away from anything. That theory did not survive contact with the reality of who she was. As days turned into weeks and weeks stretched into months with no trace of Jonelle anywhere, no sighting, no contact, no word of any kind, the investigation deepened and intensified and began to look in every direction it could find. Investigators turned significant attention toward Jim Matthews. In cases involving missing children, the people closest to the child are always examined first, and Jim understood that. He did not fight it. He cooperated fully with everything investigators asked of him. He sat down with one of the FBI's most experienced polygraph examiners, reportedly considered the top examiner west of the Mississippi River, and submitted to a lie detector test. He was told he had failed. He then took a second polygraph with the local police. Consider for a moment what that experience truly is. Your child is missing and the holidays are passing and you have not slept properly in weeks, and you are already living inside the worst nightmare any parent can imagine, and the investigators who are supposed to be finding your daughter are sitting across a table from you suggesting that you might be responsible for what happened to her. Jim Matthews kept telling the truth. Every single time. He was eventually cleared of all suspicion, and that cleared path led investigators precisely nowhere. They had no strong leads. They had no clear suspect. They had a crime scene that had been almost entirely sanitized. And the trail was going cold. The community of Greeley wrapped itself around the Matthews family with the fierce, instinctive loyalty of a place that takes care of its own. A 24-hour prayer vigil was organized and held across multiple local churches, with people taking shifts through the night to pray for Jonelle's safe return. Thousands of reward posters were printed and distributed and sent to every corner of the country. And then came something that would stamp Jonelle's face permanently into the cultural memory of an entire American generation. Jonelle Matthews became one of the very first missing children in the history of the United States to have her photograph placed on a milk carton. In the mid-1980s, there was no Amber Alert system. There was no social media. There was no way to push a missing child's photograph to millions of people in an instant the way we can today. The milk carton campaign was revolutionary. It was the most powerful distribution tool available to investigators and families at the time, and Jonelle's face was printed on cartons that traveled from coast to coast, sitting on breakfast tables and in school cafeterias and in grocery stores across the entire nation. Her case grew to such national significance that in March of 1985, just 3 months after she vanished, President Ronald Reagan stood before the country and mentioned Jonelle Matthews by name during an address about the growing national crisis of missing and exploited children. A 12-year-old girl from a small and quiet Colorado town, spoken of by the President of the United States on the national stage. And still, no answers came. The case went cold. The phone stopped ringing. The tips dried up. The investigation slowed to almost nothing. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words "I am still here," because this story is only getting started, and what comes next will change everything you think you know about how killers eventually betray themselves. 5 years passed. Then 10. Then 15. Then 20. The calendar kept moving forward and the world kept changing, and Jonelle Matthews stayed 12 years old, frozen at the moment she walked through a front door and never came back out. In 1994, a full decade after her disappearance, Jim and Gloria Matthews made the devastating legal decision to have Jonelle declared dead in absentia. Gloria spoke publicly about what it meant to live 10 years without a single answer. Without a motive. Without a reason. Without even a place to go and grieve. She asked aloud, in the quiet and exhausted voice of a woman who had been carrying an impossible weight for a decade, whether anyone knew anything at all, whether anyone could simply tell them where their daughter's body was so that they could finally, after all this time, lay her to rest with the dignity she deserved. No one answered her. The silence stretched on. Staying in Greeley became something Jim and Gloria found they simply could not do anymore. The memories were everywhere, in every street corner, every church pew, every aisle of every grocery store. The absence of Jonelle was somehow louder in the town where she had been so present. Jim and Gloria eventually left Colorado entirely, moving first to the Philippines where they served as missionaries, and later retiring to Costa Rica. Jennifer built her own life in Washington state. The family scattered, each of them carrying the same wound to different corners of the world. But Gloria never truly moved on in the way the word moving on implies. Everywhere she traveled, her eyes still scanned the faces of strangers in crowds without her even consciously realizing she was doing it. Every dream she had, Jonelle came home through the front door smiling, just like she always did. And every morning Gloria woke up and that door was still shut and that smile was still gone, and 35 years became 36 and then more. The 23rd of July, 2019. A summer morning in rural Weld County, Colorado. A construction crew is working on a new oil and gas pipeline, cutting a path through a remote stretch of open farmland roughly 15 miles southeast of the city of Greeley. The ground out here is flat and dry and unremarkable. The kind of land that stretches to the horizon and holds its secrets without drama. The bulldozer operator is moving earth when the machine strikes something that does not belong. The crew stops. They look more carefully. And what they find changes everything. Bones. Human bones. A skull, still bearing the orthodontic braces of a child. And fragments of clothing, a plaid skirt, a blouse, a sweater vest. The same outfit, described in detail in missing persons reports filed 35 years earlier, that Jonelle Matthews had been wearing the night she came home from her school Christmas concert, set her shoes neatly beside the tree, and was never seen alive again. 2 days later, the Weld County Coroner's Office made it official. The remains belonged to Jonelle Matthews, confirmed through dental records and DNA analysis. 35 years of searching, 35 years of silence, 35 years of Gloria scanning strangers' faces in crowds, and here she was, 15 miles from home, in a field, in the ground. The autopsy provided the final devastating piece of information, a single gunshot wound to the head. Jonelle had not run away. She had not wandered off. She had not met with some tragic accident. She had been murdered. Someone had taken her from that warm living room, driven her to this remote field in the December cold, and shot her. The remains were found wrapped in a white bed sheet. Her coat had been partially zipped and turned inside out, with the cuffs deliberately tucked under her armpits. When investigators carefully pulled those cuffs back, small hand bones fell out onto the earth. In her final moments, alone in a dark December field 15 miles from her Christmas tree, Jonelle had tucked her hands inside her coat to keep herself warm. She had tried to stay warm. She had been cold and frightened, and she had tried to stay warm while someone stood nearby and prepared to end her life. A 12-year-old girl. Trying to stay warm. That detail does not leave you. It is not supposed to. For Jim and Gloria Matthews, the discovery brought the most devastating kind of relief a human being can experience. The last fragile, impossible thread of hope, the thought that had never fully died, the voice in the back of Gloria's mind that whispered maybe, somehow, somewhere, was finally gone. But something else took its place. A question that had been 35 years overdue. The only question that mattered now. Who killed Jonelle Matthews? The answer had been walking around in plain sight for nearly 4 decades. Within weeks of the remains being officially identified, the Greeley Police Department announced that they had a person of interest in the murder. And this was not some shadowy, unknown figure. This was not a nameless drifter. This was a man with a public profile, a man who had run for governor, not once but twice. A man who had spent the better part of 4 decades producing legal filings and written communications and media interviews and statements of every conceivable kind, and who had referenced Jonelle Matthews in so many of them that investigators would eventually count over 1,000 separate documents bearing her name. Over 1,000. As though staying close to the case gave him something. Power, perhaps. Control over the narrative. Or maybe just the dark and irresistible pull that some killers feel toward the thing they have done, the thing they cannot undo and cannot stop thinking about and cannot stay away from no matter how many years pass. His name was Stephen Dana Pankey. In December of 1984, Pankey was 33 years old, married, a father, and living in Greeley just 2 miles from the Matthews family home. He was a member of the Sunny View Church of the Nazarene, the same congregation the Matthews family attended. He knew this neighborhood. He was familiar with the rhythms of life on these streets. He would have known the families, the houses, the routines. And on the 19th of December, the day immediately before Jonelle vanished, Pankey had been arrested at a local bank on charges of harassment and criminal trespass. His used car business had completely collapsed. He was in serious financial trouble, emotionally unraveling, and by all accounts behaving erratically in ways that the people around him had begun to notice. In the days immediately following Jonelle's disappearance, Pankey's behavior became profoundly strange in ways his then-wife Angela Hicks would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. Pankey came home and announced, with no prior discussion and no warning of any kind, that they were leaving town before daylight the following morning. They were going to Big Bear Lake in California for Christmas to visit his parents. Angela had no knowledge of any such plan. It had never been mentioned. It was sudden and rushed and carried an urgency that felt deeply wrong in a way she struggled to articulate but could not dismiss. On the drive back to Greeley after cutting the California trip short for reasons that were never satisfactorily explained, Pankey did something that burned itself into Angela's memory permanently. He told her to turn the car radio on. He needed to hear the news. Immediately, urgently, with an intensity that made no sense until it made complete and terrible sense. Consider who this man was. He had banned all forms of media from their household, no television, no radio, no newspapers, no music of any kind. He had declared their home a godly home and enforced that declaration with rigid, controlling consistency. Angela was not even permitted to drive the car herself under normal circumstances. And yet here was Stephen Pankey, the same man, demanding immediate access to news coverage of a missing girl from his own neighborhood the moment they were pointed back toward it. He needed to know what they knew. He needed to know how close they were. That was not the end of his behavior. Not even close to it. In the years and then the decades that followed, Pankey began inserting himself directly into the investigation. He approached law enforcement officials and explicitly requested immunity from prosecution in exchange for providing information about the case. He did not receive it. But he kept returning. He kept making contact. He kept talking and writing and filing and communicating. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, he generated over 1,000 separate documents referencing Jonelle Matthews. Investigators who spent time reviewing this material described the pattern as something they had rarely if ever encountered, a man who appeared to be simultaneously attempting to control and reshape the narrative of the case while being entirely unable to stop obsessing over what he had done. Unable to let it go. Unable to stay away from her name. And then there was the detail that sealed everything. From the very beginning of the investigation, from the morning after Jonelle disappeared, the Greeley police had deliberately withheld one specific piece of information from the public. They did not release it to the press. They did not discuss it in public statements. They kept it sealed, the way experienced investigators keep the most critical evidence sealed, waiting for the moment it becomes useful. That piece of information was the garden rake. The fact that whoever had stood outside the Matthews living room window, whoever had stood in the snow in the dark and watched Jonelle through the glass, had afterward walked to the family's own garage, taken their garden rake, and used it to try to sweep away the footprints they had left behind. The general public never knew about the rake. The media never reported it. The only people in the world who knew about that rake were the investigators who had found it and the person who had used it. Stephen Dana Pankey knew about the rake. In communications and statements made over the years, documents that investigators eventually catalogued and analyzed, Pankey referenced this specific detail. A detail that had never been made public. A detail that could not have been guessed. A detail that only existed in the knowledge of someone who had been there that night, standing in that snow, holding that rake. You cannot accidentally know something that was never released. There is no innocent explanation for it. And Pankey had no innocent explanation to offer. He was indicted. He was brought to trial. And what followed became one of the most remarkable prosecutions in the history of Colorado cold case investigations, because there was essentially no conventional physical evidence to present. 35 years in the ground had taken care of that. No usable DNA. No fingerprints. No forensic trace evidence of the kind that modern juries are accustomed to seeing. What prosecutors had instead was something rarer and in many ways more damning, the complete and unbroken record of a guilty man's behavior across nearly 4 decades, assembled from his own words, his own documents, his own actions, and his own inexplicable inability to simply walk away and stay silent. They had Angela Hicks on the stand, steady and clear, describing the midnight departure from Greeley, the obsessive need for news coverage, the behavior of a man she had lived with but never fully known. They had the pattern of over 1,000 documents, a fixation so sustained and so detailed that it defied every rational innocent explanation. They had Pankey's own requests for immunity, because innocent people do not negotiate immunity for crimes they know nothing about. They had his knowledge of the rake, the detail no one outside that investigation was ever supposed to know. And they had a statement from a fellow inmate who reported that Pankey had made incriminating admissions while in custody, one more thread in a web that he had spent 37 years spinning around himself, seemingly without ever understanding what he was building. The first trial ended without the clean resolution the Matthews family had waited so long for. But prosecutors did not walk away. They believed in this case. They believed in Jonelle. They came back. And the second trial delivered what no verdict can ever fully deliver but what justice demands it try: accountability. Stephen Dana Pankey was convicted of the murder of Jonelle Matthews and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The man who ran for governor. The man who filed over 1,000 documents. The man who demanded immunity and gave interviews and attended hearings and could never, for 37 years, manage to simply stay away from the name of the girl he had killed, that man would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Jim and Gloria Matthews, living out their retirement years quietly in Costa Rica, received the news they had been waiting for since a December night in 1984 when Jim walked into a warm and empty house and found a pair of small shoes beside a Christmas tree. The daughter they had chosen, the spark of their family, the girl who sang Christmas carols and begged to go to school sick and tucked her freezing hands under her arms in a dark winter field because she was trying to stay warm, she finally had something that resembled justice. It could not give her back. Nothing in this world ever could. But it meant that the man who took her would not walk free again. Jonelle Matthews was not just a face on a milk carton. She was not just a name spoken in a presidential address. She was not just a cold case number on a shelf, waiting. She was a daughter. A sister. A best friend. A girl who made everything feel like a big deal because to her, everything genuinely was. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to go to high school and fall in love and drive a car and have a life. She deserved to walk back out of that house the same way she walked in, alive and warm and buzzing with the excitement of Christmas morning just 5 days away. She did not get that. But she got the truth. And after 37 years, the truth was everything. At True Crime Traces, we believe that every single victim deserves to be more than a forgotten file, more than a name that fades with time, more than a case that closes without resolution. If Jonelle's story moved you, if it stayed with you, if it made you feel the weight of what her family carried for more than 3 decades, please like this video right now, drop a comment below, and subscribe to True Crime Traces with the notification bell turned on so you never miss another case. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Every case we bring to this channel belongs to a real person. Help us make sure the world never forgets them.